It was long past midnight when the gates of the cemetery drifted open. A single hand braced against the blackened iron to slow the wide and creaking swing. It was so long after midnight, in fact, that it was closer to dawn than to dusk, and at least some of the souls filling in through the widening gap in the graveyard's barrier were at least slightly relieved that the so-called witching hour had tolled its bells far into the distant past. They had time yet to achieve their goal, but not so much that the rising sun couldn't revive them should the task take longer than anticipated. A black night it was, with only the hint of moon hidden behind a swirling mass of charcoal clouds that blocked even the faint glint of starlight from showing them the way. As such, all they had was the flashlight in each hand and a cold silence in their ears. As if the silence was too much to bear, a short man with long, dangling fingers began to absent-mindedly read off the names written on the tombstones. Nora Jones, Charlie said, his voice neither hushed nor loud, but a lost place in between. Jeremy Santos, Dorothy Reyes, Marcus Hanley, Agathar Charmelin? That's a weird name. The others said nothing in response, but the two girls of the group shivered slightly and rubbed their hands on their biceps as if they were cold mirror images of each other. Charlie's gaze flicked to one of them, the shorter one with the wavy hair that half obscured her cream-colored face. Looks like these are mostly from the 1920s, Charlie went on. And whether he was speaking to the group or to himself was anyone's guess. 1928, 1924, 1925, 1924 again. Does anybody else think it's weird that they never mentioned the cause of death on these? Why would they do that? One girl asked. Seems a little morbid, if you ask me. It's a cemetery, Lisa. A taller man said. The rims of his glasses disappeared behind wide ears, which were emphasized by his short-cropped hair. This is the very definition of morbid. But to answer your question, Charlie, they don't put cause of death on tombstones. They only do that in movies. I thought they do it in the past, too, Charlie responded. Like as a warning, you know? He ate the berries that were striped green and they killed him. Then you'd know not to eat the green striped berries. Makes sense to me, the taller of the girls piped in. Humanity only survives by recording our mistakes and learning from them. Well, I believe that info is reserved for police reports and medical textbooks, the tall man responded. If you'll notice, they don't even put cause of death in obituaries anymore. Sometimes they do, Charlie shot back. The others were silent for a few moments as they absent-mindedly slowed their progression amongst the tombstones. The rocky growths seemed almost to glow in the night air, a fact that none of them noticed to be, in spite of the moons being obscured by heavy clouds. Over the rolling, black and blue hills covered in freshly fallen leaves, the headstones protruded like festering sores, scattered in a way that initially seemed organized but appears more haphazard the longer one peers upon them. The grave markers vanished into the darkness of other hills, taking their strange luminescence with them. As they trudged through the valleys and atop crests, the cemetery spanned in all directions, dotted here and there by the odd tree or statuary which indicated either great wealth or immense age, though more likely old wealth. Cold wind occasionally blew, rustling the leaves and sending them tumbling down their embankments, stopped only by the stones above the ancient beds. Hey! This guy was found dead in his home only a couple years ago, a third man eventually exclaimed. He was strongly built, but also slender in a way, the kind of guy who wouldn't make you feel self-conscious, but you definitely want him on your side in a hairy situation. It says right here, Harold Manhausen, 1964 to 2014, found dead in his home of no known cause. Wait, it actually says that? The tall girl asked, stepping out of line. The others stopped and turned to the strong man. I just read it to you. But that seems like such a weird thing to... Wait, I remember this guy. I heard about him a few years back. He's the guy from Jamboree Avenue. He paused for a moment and the clouds temporarily cleared, illuminating the square block of headstone before him. And in response, he turned off his light. Seriously, none of you remember this guy? He glanced around, seemingly incredulous. His audience stood in the line on the opposite side of the tombstone, facing him but unable to read the words that only he could see. The girls at the center, and Charlie and the tall man on the outside. Roger, are you going to tell us or not? The taller girl asked, her chest rising and falling with an ever-so-quickening pace, though of excitement or fear could not be determined. I was just waiting for the right moment, Roger said with a grin. He twirled his flashlight in his hands, then handed it to the person to his left. Harold Manhausen had just turned 50 when he moved into the house on Jamberry Avenue, and it was on the very first night that he started to hear things. There were creaking floorboards, doors that drifted open when the windows were all shut, and he even started to hear his windows shut on their own. Windows that he knew he'd already shut and then locked. So after a few nights of this and getting restless sleep, he called in a new home inspector. The old one had told him everything was fine, but the new one said he saw something up in the attic and he wanted to check. Harold waited for him in his living room, waited and waited, but the inspector never came down. He heard the creaks from upstairs, heard them get louder and then faster, and then they stopped. And Harold thought about going to check. But he'd worked a long day, and before he had a chance, he fell fast asleep. He woke up later to find the front door hanging open, and while the inspector's car was still parked outside, the inspector himself was nowhere to be seen. "So he called the police, right?" the girl with wavy hair asked. "Well, he took a look in the attic, but there was no inspector, so he assumed the guy had left. But his car was still there. Why would the guy just abandon his car?" That, my friends, is the question that Harold should have thought to ask. Maybe if he'd gone to the police earlier, they could have figured something out. But instead, he waited, and waited, and waited, hearing more of the creaks over his bed each night, more shuffling in the walls as if rats and mice were scurrying through them, or perhaps trying to gnaw through the wood and plaster of his walls. So he called an exterminator, but he too disappeared. And like the inspector before him, Harold just had the car towed to an impound lot, and he went on his way. But this time, he decided that he was going to solve the issue himself. So he climbed into his attic, and he waded through the insulation that came up to his thighs, staying on the crossbeams, searching for mice, rats, raccoons, birds, anything that could be making the racket of clattering, banging sounds that now accompanied the creaks and groans of the house. As he waded through the insulation, which rose up like a pink ocean, the walls seemed to breathe and to moan a mournful song around him. An odor was hidden in the fiberglass, and it now hit him, and he fled downstairs, locking the attic behind him, but by then, it was already too late. "What happened?" Charlie asked. Roger shook his shoulders. "They say that whatever was up in his attic, it had slid down the ladder when he was up there, and when he locked the door, it didn't lock it away. It locked it out of its cage. Now the creaks were joined by dark shapes in the corners of the house, scurrying sounds not in the walls, but on his floors, and across the ceiling. An odor that traveled the house with him, or dissipated as soon as he entered a room and flicked on the lights. And then finally, 3 days after his journey into the attic, the police found him, lying in the kitchen. He was dead, and lying in a puddle of blood, which was not his own, and with no obvious wounds on his body. And that, my friends, is all we know about the unfortunate Harold Manhausen. The others all stayed silent for a few moments. Taller of the girls glanced past Roger's shoulders, and in the dim light, she saw the far-off trees that formed one side of the cemetery, feeding out into a deep black forest that could swallow a person whole and leave nothing behind. "Hey, Roger, sorry to burst your bubble, but this tombstone says Ambrose Selk, 1844 to 1921. It literally doesn't say anything that you just told us." The tall girl flinched. She hadn't realized that Kevin, the man with glasses, had crossed the other side of the tombstone and read what previously only their verbose friend could see. "What? You thought that story was real?" Roger asked with a chuckle. "Come on, man, it's a graveyard. This place is like a repository for ghost stories. I couldn't pass the opportunity to make one up." "Hey, I think I see the mausoleum," the taller girl said, pointing off to her right in the direction they'd all initially been going before Roger had veered them toward poor Ambrose's bed. "Is that the right one, Jess?" the taller man asked. "It says Virgil at the top," she answered. "That's what we're looking for, right?" "Right you are for once," he responded. "That's the tomb we are looking for." As if on cue, the clouds rolled across the light above them, and all of them but Roger, who had passed on his light, flicked their electric torches back to life. The wind rustled across the grass, making it look as if something was moving within it. But only some of the group noticed this, and they shivered. Only this time it wasn't from the cold. There was something else. and the girl with the wavy hair could sense it more keenly than anyone else. The shadows loomed amongst the tombstones as they approached the great stone structure that lay before them. It rose with walls so worn and smooth by time that they appeared to be the cloaked hood of some mostly buried giant. But in that hood, no eyes stared back, no nostrils flared, only a single square was visible, an old wooden door with an iron gate clasped over it with a heavy chain. The group paused for a moment, thinking that the chain was an odd touch, but thinking little of it as that's what chains are made to do. As they stood before it, their eyes rose with the great sweeping height of the crypt, which towered far higher than it had any reason to. There were strange, misshapen forms perched at the top, but in this light and from this angle, their distinctively ugly features could not be easily determined. The tall man with the glasses shone a flashlight upon the stone and saw, atop the monolith, a single name in arcane letters of the ancient mimicry. It was a dull and fading name of Virgil. It was preordained who would go inside the mausoleum and who would remain on guard duty outside. Kevin, whose suggested plans always tended to be forced upon the others, had selected Roger to wait outside with the taller of the two women. He wanted the more serious-minded Charlie inside with him and Lisa. In accordance with his plans, Charlie pulled a crowbar out from his bag and braced it against the door of the mausoleum, slowly twisting the metal handle with a wrenching sound until there was a clicking snap and the lock broke. The chain dropped away as the door swung ajar, allowing Charlie to hold it for his companions. A moment later, there was a slight squeal and then a thudding sound, leaving only two people standing in the cold night outside the door. Roger furrowed his brow for a moment as if in consideration of something, took a breath, held it, and then proposed his quandary. "Hey, Jess," he asked. "Why'd you close the door on them?" "I think they pulled it shut when they went in," she answered him, absent-mindedly glancing around at the stillness of the slabs that stood in neat rows before them. She got the feeling that the tombstones were watching them, waiting for something, row upon row sitting as if in a church, and she and Roger were meant to be the ministers, or the entertainment. She shivered as one tombstone in particular seemed to be staring intently. For a moment, she could have sworn it moved a little closer to her. "I think the lantern will work better in here," Kevin said, snapping his fingers. Following the thinly veiled order, Charlie reached into his pack and pulled out a battery-powered lantern. He flicked the switch, and it seemed to fill the tomb with a hazy orange glow, illuminating the great empty hallway in which they stood. To either side rose high walls covered in squares that were all identical, 18 inches high by 3 feet wide. There were no visible handles, only the protruding rectangles indicating where too many bodies had been laid on slabs and buried in the walls. Down near the floor, the rectangles became larger squares, and Charlie couldn't tell what the reason or the difference was, so in his usual manner, he posed the question. "Maybe it's where they store all the urns," Lisa proposed. "You know, for the people who were cremated." "That's a possibility, as disorganized as it may seem," Kevin said, only half paying attention as his eyes skimmed from block to block. "Or maybe it's just where they store all the fatties," Charlie suggested. "You know, the people who were a little too much girth to fit in a normal vault." "Or perhaps it was only their wallets that were fat," Kevin said. He turned his nose down at the others, and his glasses fell forward an inch, pushed them back up to the bridge of his nose. "He who has the gold gets the greater burial chamber. The modern-day pharaohs, you could say. Hey, which one do you close the door?" The other two shook their heads and slumped their shoulders almost in unison. Kevin sighed. "Must have been those idiots outside. Trust me, come morning, we don't want to be found in here. We have some very upset police officers bearing down on us, and that would run counter to our cause. Before he had a chance to continue, there was a great boom from outside the tomb, as if a bolt of lightning had struck the door itself. Scarcely a moment later, and they heard the steady pounding of a torrential downpour, and they all smelled the familiar mist of a thunderous rain. More booms and thunderclaps shook the wall, and a flash of lightning shone in through the great glass room of the mausoleum, temporarily drowning out the light of their little lantern. This was accompanied by one final crack, the patter of more heavy rain, and then the sound receded to a moderate pitter-patter. "Are you guys okay out there?" Charlie called to Roger and Jess, but he doubted they could hear him over the astonishingly rapid thunderstorm. "If those idiots want to get drenched rather than come inside, then leave them be," Kevin said, returning his gaze to the brass nameplates mounted on each of the protruding rectangles. "Come on, 6 eyes are better than 2. And I forgot where I'd seen it. Help me find..." He was then interrupted again, only this time the thunderclap was much closer, almost as if the ground on which they stood had been supercharged to igniting it. It shook like a violent earthquake, causing Lisa and Charlie to lose their footing and collapse to the ground. Kevin grabbed the nearest berth and held himself upright, but his legs felt like a pair of noodles trying to stand in a violently quaking frying pan. He heard the sound of something shifting near the door, the unmistakable sound of something hard striking the door. And then, the quaking stopped. "What the hell was that?" Charlie asked. "Was that an earthquake, or was it the storm?" "Coincidence would suggest both, though I have my doubts," Kevin responded. "Go check on the others, will you?" Charlie and Lisa went to go and push open the door, but while the door handle turned easily, the door wouldn't open more than half an inch before it stopped completely. Charlie pushed harder and then turned to closing the door and trying to force it more rapidly. After the small distance, it would make a hard smacking sound and stop. "I think there's something blocking the door," he said at last. "There's something on the other side. Hey, Roger, Jess, can you hear me?" "Roger, Jess, are you there?" Lisa yelled in a quaky voice. "Jess, honey, answer if you can hear me." There was silence. "Roger, quit messing around and open the door." Growing increasingly impatient, Charlie began forcing himself against the door with his shoulder, backing up a few feet and then ramming it over and over. There was a crack at one point, but not from the door, and he fell backward with a cry of alarm. Lisa held him by his arm, and Kevin could see in the orange light that he was wincing in pain. She cradled his arm like a nursemaid, but Kevin only gritted his teeth in frustration. Then, looked around some more. When at last his agitation overtook him, he raised his hands to the others. The quake probably shook something loose, and it fell in front of the door. And it must be muffling the sound so they can't hear us and we can't hear them. So I suggest that we get what we came for and find another way out. Trust me, none of us want to be here once dawn arrives. Outside, Jess and Roger waited patiently until the thunder began to crackle overhead. Great bolts lit up the sky, shaking loose mighty chords of deep resonance that they could feel in their bones. But it was a dry storm, luckily, and so neither of them were forced inside due to the rain. Lightning arced and cracked across the sky like the veins of some great behemoth mostly hidden in the clouds, and Jess instinctively found herself huddling slightly closer to Roger. It was the quake that separated them, though they couldn't see it. It was as if the bolt of lightning had struck the ground nearby, causing the earth to explode and shake violently, forcing the two of them to stumble off the stone steps of the mausoleum and onto the cold dirt and grasping grass. The violence of the quake was overshadowed by the rumbling roar as the dirt of the cemetery started falling away into some hideously erupting chasm spreading out from the very steps of the tomb. Dirt and grass fell down into nothingness, and the gaping maw grew wider, stretching 3, 4, 5 feet across and snaking its way down amongst the tombstones, some of which fell away from their silent pews and into the black void. Jess and Roger scrambled to get away from the widening fault and realized only too late that they were on the opposite sides of it. It was Jess who noticed that it seemed to stop mere inches away from the steps of the tomb, as if the chasm was some inverted red carpet that twisted and curved its way to the closed door. Why haven't they come outside? She found herself asking, but that thought was quickly crowded out by more pertinent need to reconnect with Roger. "Hey, Raj, I don't think we should risk jumping it," she called into the sudden quietude of the night. She didn't realize until she began to speak just how silent things had become. "I wasn't dreaming of it," Roger responded as he inched closer to the line and glanced down. He couldn't see anything in the blackness below. "Why don't we meet on the other side of the mausoleum?" She gave him a thumbs up and began jogging to her right around the crypt. As she did so, she began to grow nervous, seeing all the tombstones that still encircled the mausoleum. It was like It was the center of some grand show, and all these identical tombstones were just waiting for it to begin. She quickened her pace, but the end of the mausoleum seemed to almost never come. She didn't realize just how big the structure was until she tried to go around it. And when she paused to recalibrate her bearings, she then noticed the growing blackness that was following in the form of some otherworldly fog. The edge of the fault was still just barely inside, and she could see that it was the source of the strange black mist rising from the earth itself, as if it had become some bizarre fog machine. Soon enveloped her, choking out even the light of her electric torch, and she started to stumble. She moved over to the mausoleum and put one hand against its cold stone, using it to guide herself around its perimeter, moving far slower than she originally hoped. Up ahead, she saw motion and imagined it to be Roger, but as it came closer, she didn't recognize the strange gait at which it loped, as if one of its legs had been twisted beyond repair and left it piteously limping. It was hunched over, and she could make out a contorted back that rose up nearly on level with its head, and it reached out with disproportionate arms that nearly touched the ground, with enormous hands and long, thin fingers that trailed off into nothingness. Without a moment's hesitation, Jess let go of the mausoleum and turned towards the tombstones, which stared at her with cold placidity, as she tried desperately to distance herself from the thing, which clearly wasn't Roger. Kevin grunted as he pulled another one of the small rectangles out a few inches. The caskets were closed, yes, but luckily not locked, or his plan wouldn't be possible. Charlie stood on the edge of the casket below, one hand holding the edge of the casket, while his other hand was pressed into Kevin's back, holding him steady as he balanced. 10 feet below, Lisa watched the two of them, her flashlight trained on their position. Kevin stopped for a moment, gripped the casket that he just pulled out, and used his other hand to wipe the sweat from his forehead before it had a chance to drip onto his glasses or into his eyes. It had been Lisa's idea, to Kevin's dismay, and he couldn't deny the logic of it. Over the course of 10 minutes, they began pulling out one casket after another, each only about 3 or 4 inches, enough to get a grip or foothold, but not enough to release too much of the odor they expected from the bodies which called these shelves their beds, forming a makeshift stepladder going up towards the glass ceiling of the mausoleum. Kevin was quickly growing exhausted, but he knew that he was the only one of the trio who was physically capable of pulling the stone and metal slabs from their resting places. There were only 4 more slabs to pull out, and they'd reach the ceiling. Once this work was finished, he could relocate their goal, and then the 3 of them could climb out and be rid of this silent space. There was a momentary flash of darkness, and Kevin nearly lost his footing. "The light, Lisa, please!" Kevin yelled down, and a second later the light was back up and blinding him. He grunted in agitation, and the light dropped to his chest, allowing him to see once again. Lisa apologized, then glanced over to her right. "I was just wondering." "Spit it out, Lisa," Kevin ordered after she trailed off. "Well, why did we open the one down that way?" she asked. "What?" Kevin asked. "The box down that way," Lisa motioned with the light again. Kevin followed the beam and saw that one of the larger crypts down on the floor about 15 feet from where Lisa stood was wide open. "Why did you open that one? Is that the one that we're looking for? What makes you think I opened it?" Kevin asked, his voice falling uncharacteristically soft. But even as he posed the question, he realized it couldn't have been either of the others, for Lisa wasn't strong enough and Charlie's arm was too twisted. "I thought you opened it while she was helping me with my arm," Charlie muttered. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, as if pensively considering what to do. After a moment, he began to climb back down to the ground. "Let me take a look." Without a second glance, he passed by Lisa and crouched down beside the stone slab that had been slid sideways. This struck him momentarily as odd, considering the rest of the crypts opened outward rather than sliding sideways. He then realized that the entire opening had been broken free, and the cracked slab was leaning against the casket to the left of it. "Hey, Lisa, can I have your flashlight?" Charlie asked. "I think I see something in—" Before he could finish the thought, something sprang to life inside the rectangular hole. Lisa instinctively stepped back in surprise at the sound, and she saw just enough in the quivering, wavering beam of her torch to make out something long and thin and black reaching out from the crypt. No, it wasn't just one tendril, but a series of them, 3, 4, 5 hard and spindly limbs emerging from the darkness, each immensely long and impossibly thin. Insectoid. and they seemed to spin like the blades of a blender. The end of each limb pierced Charlie's flesh along with his face, his shoulders, his arms, and his stomach, causing him to scream as they retracted back into the confines of the crypt, dragging him inward. There was nothing Lisa could do but shine the light in that direction, and the light was almost blinding as it reflected off the first shimmering black limbs and then metallic streaks and splatter of a deep crimson that were sprayed on the adjacent tombs. It was as if a garden hose had whipped loose and began spraying red wine across the stone. Lisa let out a shrieking screech and stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern. Its orange glow cast itself at odd angles, creating and emphasizing bizarre shapes amongst the shadows of the crypt. She backed towards the wall and almost tripped on her own ankles, but managed to regain her footing. Above her, Kevin struggled to stifle his own cry of alarm, but neither of the two could outdo the howls from Charlie, whose cries and gurgling hacks came out as incomprehensible. Mustering her last ounce of morbid courage, Lisa shined the flashlight on the place where Charlie had been, but he was no longer there. His screams were abruptly halted in tune with a guttural yell, somehow chittering, gnashing sound, and a spray of red and streaky pink sprayed out from the hole. Her light dropped to the new puddle, and she could see patches of raw flesh floating in pools of scarlet. More sprayed from the hole, and this time the messiness of the thing within was visible. She saw a finger, an ear, a bit of scalp, and part of a foot sliding to a stop across a stained stone. And from the deep recesses of the hole in the wall, those insectoid tendrils were, again, beginning to emerge, scraping across the polished marble as a high clicking sound became muffled by the shifting of some great girth within. "Lisa, up here!" Kevin cried out as Lisa grabbed the nearest pulled-out casket, her feet sliding on the one below as she pulled herself from the ground. Up above her, Kevin was furiously reaching for more of the caskets and pulling them out, working his way towards the ceiling and their only means of escape. Lisa scrambled from one crypt to the next, hoping desperately that none of these held things like the shuffling, clicking thing below. She shook her head, trying to ignore the realization that whatever it had never been human. It was something wholly different. As she grabbed one casket, she lost her grip on the flashlight and it tumbled down, shattering on the stone below and winking out. Only the pale orange of the overturned lantern could show them the path which Kevin was rapidly finishing, and that left her with an eerie impression of dark hues in the hollowed halls, where they should never have been. "Climb, Lisa! Faster!" Kevin's tense voice echoed from above her. The orange light was blotted out, and she glanced down to see the great mass on far too many legs had crawled over it, leaving them in near darkness. And in that darkness, only the sound of 3 pairs of legs could be heard scrambling from the glass ceiling, which was now their only escape. Kevin reached the ceiling and pressed his hands desperately against the glass. To his relief and astonishment, the glass opened rather like a door or an unlatched window, and he was able to scramble out onto the cold and dirty roof of the mausoleum, not taking a moment to rest. He regained his balance and then scrambled back to the opening, throwing both his arms down to grab Lisa. Past her shoulders, he could see the horrible chittering thing below beginning to twist and thin out. It took him only a second to realize that the thing wasn't changing shape. It was changing perspective. It had braced itself against the wall and started climbing up after him, never losing pace, never slowing down, but angrily tearing caskets from the wall as it passed them. His heart sank as he realized that it was climbing faster than Lisa was, and so he grabbed her by the elbows and started dragging her out through the hole. Lisa cried out as something held her left ankle, and for a terrified second, she thought the hungry thing had caught her. She imagined the severed shreds of poor Charlie smeared across her pants and shoes as the gnashing teeth of the thing bit into her. But that wasn't the sensation that assailed her. Instead, it was like something had a grip on her foot and was holding her fast. Kevin grunted and pulled, and something tore as Lisa slid upward and started through the hole. He grabbed her under the armpits and dragged her the rest of the way, and she fell onto the rough, unpolished stone of the mausoleum's roof. A second later, she glanced down at her left foot and began to scream. There was a severed hand firmly attached around her ankle. Its skin was leathery and gray, or so it appeared in the dark gloom which oppressed them. It ended in the middle of the wrist, where the blackened bone and frayed flesh dangled disconnectedly. A piece of cloth was still attached to part of it, sunken into the rotted, shriveled skin that terminated in gangly, broken fingernails. It was those fingernails which were digging into the cuffs of her pants, tearing jagged holes. Without thinking, Kevin stomped on the hand and it slid out from around Lisa's ankle. Holding his breath, he grabbed the limb and made to throw it back into the open hole of the glass skylight, where that thing below would likely gobble it up to some terrible glee. But before he let go, he noticed the twinge of motion from his hand, the flicker of muscular contraction as it brushed his skin. He let go and it vanished into the blackness of the hole. Together, he and Lisa closed the skylight, and Lisa held it firm while Kevin went to grab the nearest ugly gargoyle which lined the roof. Luckily, it wasn't attached, having been held in place by its own weight. He then dragged it over to the glass, leaning it against the side opposite of the bronze hinge in such a way that it wouldn't break the glass, but neither would it allow the glass to move. There was a thud as darkness hit the other side of the glass and began to spread out across the surface like some pitch-black fog. Yet it stayed on the other side, and the horrified Kevin and Lisa backed away slowly. Roger shuffled along with his arms stretched out before him, the dark glimmer of fog obscuring his vision almost entirely. Above his head he could see only 4 or 5 stars, and their dim light was not strong enough to show him the way. The rest of the sky was blotted out by the oppressive black clouds which lay as thick and impenetrable as the fog in which he wandered. Initially, he moved along and kept his right hand against the side of the tomb, shuffling along its peripheral wall. But he tripped on something and he couldn't see, and then stumbled. And the moment his hand left the cold bricks of the mausoleum, the entire structure seemed to vanish into the mist. And as hard as he tried, Roger found himself unable to rediscover it. Sweat began to trickle down his head, and he felt it drip down his back, thick beads of condensed nerves that did no favors for his anxiety. With nothing else to do, Roger slowed his pace but continued moving. After a while, he found the ground becoming far less sturdy. It was as if he'd wandered over into some junkyard with a manner of strange objects littered across the ground. Except that whatever it was, which kept tripping him up, was too dark to properly see. He could tell that the objects were hard and thin, and they were made of odd clattering sounds as he kicked them. But there were more and more, as if he was approaching the source of the mess. Just like a junkyard, his nose and mouth were assaulted by a pungent odor, first agitating but quickly becoming disorientating, and finally near devastating. It was so bad that Roger had to raise his hand to his nose and pull his shirt up over his mouth. Ever so steadily, the fog began to clear. No, not clear exactly, but to brighten up, going from black to a dark gray and finally into a shimmering silver with hints of pale and even white. As the fog started to change, the strange objects at his feet became less and less numerous, and what little he could make out looked like a little more than shattered pieces of white clay or plaster, most in minuscule portions but some in strange shapes, long and thin like uncarved forks that were far too long for any practical use. The fog eventually became completely white, but as its hue became more pleasant, its thickness became even more frustrating. In some places, the fog took on an almost physical component, and soon the ghostly visage of a tall, thin tree started looming into view. Roger was becoming nervous at this point, as most of the cemetery had been devoid of trees, and no part of the trees placed as closely together as he was seeing in this portion of it. Curious at the shining patch of one tree, he walked closer to investigate. He suspected it may have been a little more than the sprung faucet of a dripping sap, moving its excruciatingly slow passage toward the ground. He touched the tree, and his hand came back sticky, confirming his suspicions. He decided he should backtrack and see if he could find the mausoleum there. Unfortunately, the sap on the tree he touched proved itself to be far greater a bond than he expected, and his hand became firmly attached. He pulled and he wrenched, and finally, with a moderate amount of physical pain, his hand came from the plant. It was time to leave. It was a dark evening, and his companions needed him. The odor was beginning to dissipate, so it was time to quit exploring and resume their plan. Muttering underneath his breath, Roger then turned to make a course to the right, which would have likely have been heading south. But his body froze without warning, coming to a dead stop in his tracks. It only took him a few seconds to realize that the reason his body had lost all momentum was because he was stuck. And to make matters worse, he could easily recognize the reason why he was stuck. He was standing in the center of an enormous spiderweb strung between two trees. He'd heard of such things in orchards, where massive amounts of spiders spun webs that covered whole groves, looking like a silvery mesh meant to protect the fruit, leaves, branches, and limbs. But in the cases he'd seen, the webs were haphazard and heaped upon each other, as if the spiders were warring for territory. Here, it was far different. Cleaner, purer, as if one spider alone had meticulously crafted this massive web. And it was thick, too. Thick enough that the more he fought, the more enmeshed in the web he became. And as he squirmed and fought, he came to the dreaded realization that it didn't matter whether or not his sneakers could touch the forest floor. He couldn't get the momentum or the thrust to free himself. He strained and grunted with all his might, trying to pull in his outstretched arms, but it was as if they were shackled out in the pattern of crucifixion. Only here, those cold nails were wispy mesh that wrapped around him tighter and tighter with every heave and every hoe. At last, he stopped and tried to catch his breath. He breathed hard, gasping for air, and finally decided to steady his breathing and focus on the forest around him. What if the spiders that made this are poisonous? He began to think, and a tremor went through his body as the vision of him spasming in his last convulsive moments as blood and spittle oozed out of his mouth, slowly asphyxiating him. He had to free himself. But before he could exercise any renewed vigor, something in the fog caught his eyes. There was a deformity on the tree about 20 feet away, an odd, bulbous, growing shape, as if the tree was developing a massive tumor on its side. He squinted, trying to see by the enigmatic light of the mist. The tumor twitched, turning, rotating on the tree. And then, as if it sensed his perception, it began to bulge out and move slowly down the tree. To Roger, it brought to his mind the memory of his younger brother crawling around under the rug when he was 2 years old. But whatever the bulge was, as it reached the ground, it broke away from the tree, and he realized it was far less ideal than a toddler. And as thin, spindly legs rose up and spread out in all directions, he realized, with a cold weight in his stomach, that there was nothing beneath the bulge. The odd shape was actually the body which had produced his silky chains. It scuttled closer, and every few feet, more of it would become more visible. He could see the legs in greater clarity, how each one broke in 4 separate places in order to fan out like a parachute. He could see the bulbous body was actually 2 segmented pieces connected on adjoining sides, and he could see a third, smaller body, and a series of black dots that covered the face above the twitching mandibles the size of Roger's arms. He could see the hairs that grew thick across its body of this creature, but most jarring of all was the point that the rear segment tapered off into, the point which likely held the venom that Roger feared. Or perhaps something far, far worse than this creature was carrying, a brood of young ready to enter in this horrid new world. There was a clicking off to his left, and Roger tore his gaze away from the monstrosity to see, with a terrifying reality, that more trees were covered in similar tumors. There had to be at least half a dozen of them, and they were beginning to twitch and rotate like the one which now came within mere feet of him. These two were shuffling towards the ground and scuttling across the freshly mown grass, and towards the web that held Roger aloft between 2 trees. The creature nearest him reached out with its nearest segmented leg and brushed tentatively against Roger's right leg, causing him to cry out and pull away. It backed away with a speed that surprised and alarmed him, and then relaxed. It reached out for the web to his left and started to pull itself up, off the ground and parallel to him. All Roger could see was the stinger beginning to throb, and he turned to his right, staring, tears welling up in his eyes.
"Help me!"
he stammered.
"Help me, please!"
Lisa stood back and watched as Kevin lay sprawled across the ground. He was about 4 feet away from the pitifully grotesque gargoyle that rested upon the glass, holding it firmly shut, and he had one ear pressed against the roof of the crypt, his eyes closed and tensely focused. "Everything is quiet down there," Kevin said, his voice barely a whisper. "There's nothing moving in the mausoleum." But even as he spoke, she could see the darkness pressed against the other side of the glass, looking one moment like smoke and the next like some fleshy black mass squished against the barrier that, for some unassailable yet wondrous reason, refused it access across the periphery. The darkness moved from time to time, rhythmically, regularly, and she imagined that it was the motion of the monstrosity breathing. "Come over here and listen," Kevin told her, his voice still low and seemingly far away. She shook her head, and so he opened his eyes and glared at her in a look that gave her no choice but to oblige. Keeping a hard distance from the skylight, she leaned down and pressed her right ear against the cold and blocky stone. There was no sound initially, but after a moment she began to hear the sound of wind, slowly moving as if through a tunnel. "Do you hear that?" Kevin asked her. She nodded. "It's something deeper than the crypt." He closed his eyes again for a moment and then raised his head up slightly, propping it against the palm for support. "Tell me, Lisa, have you ever heard of Gaia?" "No," was all she could muster. "Technically, I'm referring to the Gaia hypothesis. It's actually fairly complicated, but to put it in layman's terms, it suggests that the Earth is, in a way, alive." "What do you mean alive?" "I mean that the Earth is a living organism, one that grows and changes and..." He glanced down at the ground, then repositioned his ear against it. "And breathes," he said slowly. "It may sound crazy, but it's in the Bible, in a way." "What? You don't believe me?" "It's when the Israelites are wandering in the desert. This one man leads a rebellion against Moses, and in one movement, he, his family, and his followers are swallowed by the hungry earth. The earth opened its jaws and ate them all." Kevin's gaze was becoming more intense, and Lisa tried to raise herself up, but Kevin quickly grabbed her by her arm and then held her down. "Listen," he ordered, using his strength to force her. "Listen. Can you hear it? Beyond the breath, it's the greater depth, the sound of something else." Lisa wanted nothing more than to pull away from him and scramble to the other side of the roof, but she knew she wasn't strong enough. So she did as he commanded and pressed her ear once again against the rough and broken stone. She listened past the rushing wind and through the rock, and she could hear something else, something faint but rhythmic, a groaning so methodical that it almost sounded like a metronome. There was a faint rasp, as of gas released from hydraulics, the churning of some unknown piece of clockwork far below the crypt. "It's Gaia," he told her. "It's the machinery of the earth. For what is the earth if not the greatest living machine?" He released his grip on her arm as she scrambled to her feet and backed away quickly from him. Slowly, ever so dreadfully slowly, Kevin rose to his and stared at her with wide eyes. He continued to stare at her as he walked over to the edge of the crypt's roof and finally tore his eyes away from her. It was only when Korah was swallowed that the Israelites were saved. You see, in those arcane days, they knew the meaning of sacrifice. They knew that a starving desert of an earth needed to be fed. It's a machine, organic, crafted by the hands of the Most High, and so it demands what he demands. Water won't do, neither the fruit of the land or clothes or gold. It needs the oil of humanity, the stuff that holds the life. It must be fed, Lisa. It should be fed with blood. Kevin suddenly lunged for her, throwing his arms out like claws, scraping at her skin, her clothes, her hair, and she tried to whip him away with her arms. She twisted and scrambled out of his grasp, and he yelled an indistinguishable roar at her, but the roar devolved into a frenzied mess of jumbled words, only some of which she could make out. Spittle flew from his mouth as he chased after her, and at last, he caught her in the corner, wrapping both hands around her neck. He turned her to her side and forced her to stare down at the ground. "Do you see it?" he cried, almost more animal than man. "Do you see how thirsty it is?" And indeed, she could see that the ground looked almost scorched, with great cracks spreading out like blistered and broken skin. As she stared, the ground almost seemed to shimmer. "It's reacting," he whispered, his voice dropping low. "It only swallowed Korah because he brought rebellion into the hearts of the Israelites. And now, we, you, me, Charlie, we let something out. And it's tearing a hole in creation." His grip tightened around her throat, causing her to whimper in pain as he pushed her ever closer to the edge. There's another world bleeding through, and it's corrupting the earth, sucking the life from it. So we need to give it some of that fuel back. If we want the earth to survive, then we need to feed the machine, Lisa. But before he had a chance to push her over the edge, she jabbed her elbow into his gut, right below his sternum, knocking the wind out of the lunatic. His grip on her neck loosened enough for her to break free, and without thinking, she shouldered him in the chest, knocking him off balance. She stumbled backward and dropped to the floor, where she grabbed his left shin, gripping the meat of his leg as hard as she could and lifted, toppling the man sideways over the barrier demarcating the edge of the roof. He spun over the parapet, but held onto the stonework as he dangled in the air. Pity took her momentarily as she reached out to grab his hand to try to keep him from falling. His head was turned to the ground, but when she took his hand, he turned back to her and she saw the same manic look in his eyes. "Can you hear him?" Kevin asked, grasping for air between each word. Then he picked up speed and spat the rest of his gibbering, incoherent thoughts. Silent footsteps in the dark. His eyes flashed like fog, startling Lisa, and she relaxed her grip. Kevin slid loose and fell the 3 stories to the ground, hitting it with a hard and sickening crunch as joints exploded and bones shattered. Blood pooled out of his mouth and his eyes and ears, and the foggy eyes were drowned in pools of crimson which looked as dark as the near lightless sky. There was a rumble before she had a chance to pull her gaze away. The ground began to quake, the cracks rapidly closing up on themselves, and then, as Lisa looked on in horror, the ground around Kevin began to spread apart, a new fault opening up with him in the center. Only this fault didn't stretch on like a crack, but bulged in the middle, and crater walls rose up around him. Bones slid into view from beneath the earth, lining up like jagged teeth around the body of her friend turned attacker. Soon it became apparent to her that it was no mere canyon forming, but the gaping maw of the earth itself. Like a limp doll, Kevin slid down a widening tunnel beyond the bony teeth, beyond the bones of humans long since dead and buried. Before he disappeared completely, she could see strange skeletal masses that resembled nothing she had ever seen, the fragmented remains of things before the age of man. And then, in a fraction of a terrible moment, the body of Kevin was gone into the gaping mouth, which began to slowly close. The bones disappeared, the teeth retracting inward like fangs past their use, and the maw became a crater, which became little more than a crack in the ground. Before it closed completely, however, there was a putrid odor as black smoke issued forth, drifting across the sparse grass, floating among the tombstones, never dissipating, but moving, and seeming to grow stronger as it did. Lisa watched, frozen in place, as the darkness reached the edge of the cemetery. But there it stopped, building up in mass. It was the gate surrounding the graveyard. The fog could not cross the iron barrier. Jess moved quickly among the tombstones, twisting around them and occasionally glancing back to see if the thing in the fog was still behind her. After only a moment, she totally lost sight of it, but still she continued to run, trying to put up as much distance as possible between her and the deformed thing that wasn't Roger. She wasn't panicked, that was for sure. Rather, she was being careful, keeping herself safe. Soon the fog left her and she found herself running through a cemetery equally dark. Yet she could see the feeble light of the few stars reflected off the waist-high grave markers. When once she stopped to take a breath and glance behind her, she saw only the great black cloud that floated almost half a mile away. Not in the sky, but on the ground. blotting from sight the mausoleum that held her companions. As she stared, she heard a faint sound, a clattering sound, a creaking sound, a cry that pierced the night. But this was almost instantly swallowed up by the black mist, which was, even now, starting to reach out with its black tendrils and engulf the rest of the graveyard. She continued her course, not knowing where she was going, but knowing that there were other entrances through which she could escape this place. The hills rolled all around her, dotted with stone slabs and statues that may have been beautiful or nostalgic in the day, but gave an eerie appearance in the dark, like the dead forms of things frozen in time, ready at any moment to spring to life and begin a stiff march towards the unsuspecting intruders in their realm. The hills, to her, combined a relief and perplexity, obscured even more from view than the clouds and the fog, leaving her wandering in a virtual maze, hoping desperately that her straightforward path wasn't being deviated by the rises and falls of corpses-filled earth. After a while, the tombstones began to grow simultaneously larger and older, their words nearly worn away and the markers of far older days standing like pillars on which a motionless statue may rest. Jess tried to make out some of the names on these tombstones or perhaps the dates, but what few stones that she could read, she recognized as bearing inscriptions, at first in obvious Latin, and then, in the oldest rock, in what was assumed to be Greek. None of these she could read, and she didn't even recognize any numbers that could tell her how old these possessors of these memorials may have been. This part of the cemetery gave her a feeling of an ancient placidity, as if even the memories of long-dead ghosts were wiped clean from this sterilized environment. She heard a cry from nearby, and she instinctively ducked down, hiding behind a small statue and peering around in the direction from which it had come. At first she saw nothing, but then she caught the sight of motion from the crest of a nearby hill. Its long arms and gangly fingers immediately brought to mind the thing that she had seen at the mausoleum, and she knew that it was the source of the sound, which under her watch, again, croaked out like a guttural bark. It was moving in her direction. Moving swiftly, Jess found a nearby pillar with broken chunks along its shaft, and she used these to start shimmying up to the top. It was arduous, but she struggled desperately and stifled grunts as she used every ounce of strength she had. But after a minute, she felt the top of the pillar and dragged herself up over it and over its edge. At the top, there was a platform that sank inward only a few inches, and in its center was a slick slime still damp with dew. She slid down a bit and rubbed her knee against the muck, which soaked through her jeans and put a chill on her leg. She peered over the edge and saw, somewhat more distinctly, the humanoid thing that still followed. It kept its back arched, its arms spread to either side, what could pass as a rotted nose sniffing the air as it seemed to follow her prior path exactly. Occasionally it would drop down on all fours and hold its face only a few inches above the ground, then growl and rise back up on two legs, always following her path directly. And it was moving in her direction. Thinking quickly, Jess looked around and noticed another pillar to her left, about 5 feet away, and less than 10 feet from the roof of another crypt. Without hesitating, she stood up and leapt over to the next pillar as quietly as she could, landing swiftly on a platform that was now inverted and convex. With its angular state, it nearly caused her to fall, but she regained her balance, with just enough time to leap with her last bit of strength towards the crypt. She soared through the dark, her whole body tilting forward as her arms swung wildly. Her feet missed the roof of the crypt, but she hit the corner with her stomach and again stifled a grunt. She then held back a scream while her legs dangled freely. Her hands clawed at anything to grasp and immediately grabbed onto the crack in the roof. Straining, she pulled herself up and over the lip of the crypt roof, then rolled onto her back. She stared at the sky as she tried her best to breathe as silently as she could. She heard the sound of the thing below, moving loudly through the grass and among the tombstones, scraping as if with knives into the hard stone memorials around it. She listened intently and realized that it seemed to be circling the original pillar she climbed up, dragging those same sharp claws against the stone, although she had the momentary image of not knives but long claws etching cracks and shallow lines into the stone. It circled the pillar for what felt like an hour, growling and gibbering in some guttural language as it did so, and then, she heard it grunt and bark before becoming more distant. After another eternity, the sound of the malformed man-like thing vanished into the cold night. But no sooner could she breathe a sigh of relief before another sound assaulted her nerves. It was far different from the other, far stranger. It was the sound of something shuffling below, slow and steady. It moved at an agonizingly slow pace, sliding like something enormous being dragged amongst the tombstones. There was a sound like air escaping from a pipe. That hissing steam belted out of the hollow tube. She tried to stay where she was, laying on her back on the roof of the crypt, only 4 lone stars peering down from far above her. Eventually, she had to know what the sound was, and to know what was happening so very, very slowly down on the ground. And so, as imperceptibly as she could, she rolled over onto her front and pulled herself to the edge of the roof and then peered over the edge. She wasn't really sure what she was seeing at first. She could still see the strange statues of shapes unrecognizable, could see the pillars that held a non-existent palace. There were the smaller tombstones, of course, the odd crypt breaking the landscape like the one on which she hid. But there was something else, something stranger. There was a long trail of darkness stretching itself amongst the graves, twisting at odd angles and growing from over one hill and disappearing over another. It was like the fog had taken the form of a great tentacle that was stretching out further and further, searching for something, or perhaps someone. A shiver went through the blackness, a glint of light from up above, and in a shimmer she began to recognize with a horrible truth what she was actually seeing. Nothing could have prepared her for the reality that such things existed in her world. She had seen such things in textbooks and on documentaries, had heard about them in the deeply southern regions, but never had she imagined one so utterly massive as to be large enough to stretch across whole hills for hundreds upon hundreds of feet. There was another shiver and she could see a glint, a flash across the scales, a tubular body that crawled amongst the dead with neither arms nor legs, but in a manner wholly alien to beings with limbs for locomotion. The steady shuffle was that the body was sliding its way across the graves and between the tombstones, the sound of a hydraulic release from where she assumed, based on the direction of its motion, was its insufferable head to be. Unable to take in the sight for more than a few seconds, Jess rolled back onto the roof of the crypt and closed her eyes, choosing the darkness of her closed eyelids over the darkness of that thing upon which those feeble lights in the sky reflected. She heard more screams in the distance, but they were cut off almost immediately as a tremor shook the crypt. She tried not to scream while tears rolled down her cheeks. Then, all was silent, motionless. She waited a few more minutes before steeling herself to peer over the edge of the crypt. The massive creature was gone. Its body vanished into the steadily encroaching mist and dark. There were no screams, no cries or sounds more foreign to her. But she waited for a while longer. At long last, when she felt she could stand the silence no longer, she swung her legs over the ledge and began to climb to the ground. She froze when she landed on her feet and glanced around in case the soft thud of her soles had been heard. There was still nothing, but a warm breeze blew across her face, caressing her skin. She glanced in the direction from which the breeze had come and saw the great black wall of fog stretching and gliding across the tombstones and pillars and graves, swallowing them up into blackness as it edged ever closer to her. But as she stared, something began to take form within it, a humanoid shape. And for one breathless second, she feared it was the deformed creature which had hunted her before. Her fears became relief when she recognized its more normal proportions and its obviously still living complexion. Exhaling heavily, a smile crossed her face while more tears wetted her face, and she began grasping as emotions flooded her. It was Roger. He was still alive. But where had he been? She stumbled her way towards him to embrace him, but stopped a few feet away when she met his gaze. His eyes looked glassy and lost, as if he'd been in a daze, and his jaw hung slack with a thin trickle of drool losing itself in one corner of his mouth. "Roger?" she asked with a quivering whisper. "Roger, what happened to you? Are you okay?" Her words seemed to snap him into focus, and his jaw snapped shut and his eyes regained their focus. He squinted and turned towards her, his eyes going again wide before half closing again. A smile crept across his own face, but it was of a far different caliber than hers. His was a twisted grin, higher on one side than the other, his shoulders tensing, and he took a moment to jerk his neck. She heard an audible crack. "Oh, Jess," he said, his words slithering from his lips. "How lovely it is to see you both." The smile drained from her face as he said these words, and his eyes again grew wide, and she saw an expression wholly indiscernible on him. It was as if he were simultaneously terrified, overjoyed, and angry. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. He hit a catch on his side and it flipped around, revealing a 3-inch blade that locked into place. He started to laugh as he darted forward towards Jess, causing her to twist sideways and tumble over a tombstone. She rolled in the grass and tried to rise to her feet, but he was already there and swinging the knife. Luckily, she was thin with baggy clothes, as he only managed to cut a slash in her shirt and avoid her exposed flesh. But he swung again, and she ducked down, twisting as she did and side-arming him in the stomach. He tumbled to the ground and hit his shoulder on another tombstone, the knife sliding from his hand. Jess ran over to grab it, but he was already closer to it than she was. So she only had enough time to round him, keeping the stone moniker between them as she started scrambling away amongst the memorials. She didn't have the energy or strength to ask what he was doing, and with the look in his eyes, she didn't think he had an appropriate answer for her. For now, all she could do was hope to lose him, as she'd lost the twisted thing from earlier. But Roger was smarter than this thing, and he kept his eyes trained on her as he rose and began to sprint after her, laughing as he did. "I'm going to get you two!" he screamed after her, no longer worrying about what could hear them in the graveyard. "I'm going to cut you up and feed you to them. They want you, like I want you. You can't run forever, and there's nowhere to go. Nowhere is already here, and its king is hungry for you." She ignored him and dodged amongst the statues. Many of them were angels with beautiful faces and flowing gowns with swords or spears. Others were monks who wore shambling robes and held unnamed tomes. But some of the graves struck her, even in her addled state. Statues of angels with claws at the tips of their wings and horned tails. Statues of reptilian creatures that looked like angry dogs. Statue of arms that were missing fingers or heads that were missing eyes and scalps. And among these grotesque stonework, she could hear the manic laugh of Roger as he described what he would do to her. Some of it lewd and sexual, but some of it hideously monstrous, sadistic to a degree that she could never have expected from him. But the way he spoke, the things he described seemed to suggest only preparatory, or as if there was someone else that he intended to deliver her to. Someone who wanted the scraps, or perhaps what little remained of when the flesh would be stripped away. Suddenly from the tombstone and statuary, there arose a great crypt unlike any she had seen before. Massive columns rose up 2, maybe 3 stories, overlaid with ivy which was withered and flaking. There were no windows, but murals too dark to see in the near starless night, and no name appeared above the entrance. To her, this looked more like a temple than a mausoleum, though the dangling iron gate which stood in near collapse before a heavy oak door confirmed that it was indeed a crypt, and no place to which grave robbers were allowed entrance. Behind her, Roger screamed again, no words, at least none comprehensible, but cries and howls. She couldn't tell if he was in pain or still raving, but the fact that he was growing louder confirmed that he had not been slowed by anything else in the cemetery. He screamed again, sounding more animal than human, as if his humanity was sloughing away and revealing only a bestial creature in her midst. With only the slightest of hesitation, Jess turned from the night and ran to the door. The door stood ajar, frozen in place, its wooden frame and mounting so old it had worn to a nightly black. There was no sound from within the mausoleum except for the footsteps of the girl who entered its confines, and despite the raving lunatic coming for her, She moved slowly, seemingly against her own accord. Light streamed in faint through the half-closed portal behind her, though from where the light came, she didn't think to wonder. Instead, she allowed her eyes to adjust to the gloom of the necrotic silence that seemed to swallow the sounds from outside. And soon, even her own footsteps fell soundless upon a coal-black floor of unknown matter. But in the gloom, her eyes changed. And soon, that which had previously lay hidden in the dark began to take form and present itself to her. Along the walls were ancient images and arcane symbols. Against one were what happened to be dark waves in a raging sea, with a floating ship nearly capsized by typhonous monsoons. Lightning in the sky seemed weak against the power of the waves, and the sailors aboard the ship, decked in garb indecipherable of any generation, stared up in fear. But as she backed slowly away, she saw the full picture. She realized that the true danger lay beneath their vessel, where a great dragon roiled in the deep, kicking up the waves. The dragon had tendrils that flowed away from it, its neck twisted around beneath the vessel, while its legs spun and churned the pitchy deep. It had wide hips, and from beneath were lesser creatures, which eyed the ship with open jaws and glaring, gleaming eyes. Jess stared at a spot point in the portrait, the place where the sea met the sky, and she saw something she couldn't quite make out. She discovered in confusion that by walking slowly to the left and following the wall, the strange figure began to grow, as if birthed through the enigmatic meeting ground. The images morphed as she followed them, showing something still indiscernible, somehow frozen, and yet emerging simultaneously from some place beyond the battleground, someplace darker and colder. The freezes became a land of ice and dark snow, with not one but two ships trapped by the cold and frozen at dangerous angles and lifted up from the waters in which they should have sailed. She couldn't make out the name of one of the ships, for it was turned toward her, but the stern of the other was fully visible. She could just make out the faint name of Erebus. The word turned in her mind, and yet she couldn't bring her mind to inwardly speak it. The name bounced like a burning coal too hot to touch. The name vanished as she moved on to the mural, seeing the world of ice become a realm of darkness. Something appeared in that darkness, a strange creature, a twisted black goat, floating above 1,000 twisted and deformed trees. Trees with long tendrils stretched like fingers, and a gaping maw that cried out to the goatish creature. And to Jess, it almost seemed like these tree things were worshipping it. She moved beyond the unholy panorama, seeing beyond the goat a darkness deeper than anything she could imagine, a darkness so rich and vivid that it seemed to take physical form in an almost humanoid form. Jess backed away when she saw the names lining the borders of the pictures, some in languages and alphabets she could never hope to enunciate, but others in plain English, as if carved into the dark stone around her. There were names like Mott and Tiamat, the latter of which brought her mind inexorably to the dragon she had seen beneath the ships. But there were more names. Legamel, Kali, Saturn, and Cherbidus. She backed further away and saw the strange entities that swirled around the walls in vivid detail, almost alive and swimming in the black abyss around her, with limbs never meant to be fighting and clawing each other, reaching out to feed upon each other, or else to feed upon any who dared to gaze upon them. And among them all, Jess could again see the deeper form, the darkness existing and yet not existing, the vaguely anthropoid form which had sired them all, not in physicality, but in spirit and in will. She thought of the goat over the woods, but this too vanished into the terrible darkness as the one word again echoed in her mind: Erebus. Her eyes grew wide as she saw him, for the first time, looking out of the picture and staring at her with cold, empty, lifeless eyes. She saw it as a silhouette, standing in the doorway, human and motionless. The shadow of a hand pointing at the door in the opposite wall. Without turning around, Jess reached for the handle of this strangely symboled door, twisted the cold, frost-covered handle, and pulled it open to see. Roger saw the temple before him. Rising with the spires and buttresses and all manner of strangely colliding architectural styles that mixed and wove like a madman's fever dream. There were towers and grotesques that looked down upon the screaming man, and he briefly took in the sight, barely able to see the nearest sanctuary in the feeble light of the pitch-dark sky. Black stars glistened but failed to illuminate the furthest reaches of the temple. After the faintest moment of hesitation, Roger ran through the open door and into the gloom that waited him inside. His eyes adjusted almost immediately, and he was able to see the masterful artwork that would have given Goya nightmares. Demonic dwarves danced through the bedchambers of noble lords and faint maidens, climbing into their beds as they slept, pulling up the sheets and feeding their hideous desires. Wounds of a great many manners painted the sheets in colors that Roger was unable to determine in the dark. But he could see the mighty wings of one who stood in the entry to those doors of those chambers, staring like a gentleman itself upon the hedonism and the feeding frenzy, staring with a melancholic grin. Roger, his mind blazed and fractured as it was, shook in fear while simultaneously cackling in his attempt to quell the raucous laughter. He moved along and saw other pictures, where things hid beneath beds, their long, spidery legs just beginning to emerge as a dozen red eyes began to glow in those dark spaces, those unchecked, unswept parts of the bedrooms turned feeding grounds. However, Roger froze when he looked through a window of one bedroom and saw a tree stretching forth its branches. Like a cool wind on a burning desert, his emotional turmoil was swept aside, and Roger could think clearly, could see clearly, could remember clearly. His hands and feet were bound by the webbing so effectively that he rose up into the air and barely felt anything as the great globular body with its needle-thin limbs scuttled and climbed up beside him. It stared at him with glowing red eyes, so many eyes, and pincer-like mandibles moved rhythmically, as did the great point of the stinger below the body. The stinger drew close, brushed up against his leg of his pants, tapped gently, and began to press down. The fabric of his denim jeans beginning to shred and tear. And then with a flurry of movement almost too quick for him to see, the needle retracted back into the arachnid body and the monstrous creature began to retreat from the web, back to the ground where it landed with barely an audible whomp. The noxious odor assaulted Roger's nostrils, nearly burning the hairs away. It was the smell of a dumpster or perhaps something worse, and it only grew stronger as the seconds ticked by. Roger's world began to swim, and he imagined that the smell of meat left to rot for a month, of eggs burned and rotten, of decay no longer fresh and not yet ancient. The spider scurried away as if to escape from the fumes that assaulted them. But Roger was left defenseless against the attack, so all he could do was attempt to hold his breath and persevere. The odor was soon joined by a peculiar sound, a deep and yet simultaneously high-pitched whine or a moan. For a moment, Roger thought it was the sound of whales driven mad with hunger, consuming anything that would fit into their mouths, whether it be krill or hapless diver. The smell continued to worsen, though he didn't understand how it was even possible. And then, his vision began to blur. He saw the trees distorting, thin tendrils starting to reach out for them, reaching like bony fingers for the only one left to perceive them. He opened his eyes wide and in horror realized that the trees had actually begun to move. One by one, they had begun to crack the surface of the earth and pull up their roots, which trailed behind them like gutted carcasses as they started a slow procession towards the man trapped in the web. The fog drifted amongst the trees, covering the roots back up like freshly dug earth. But with each motion of the tree things, the fog was displaced, and their terrible visage was revealed. These moving, active, arboreal monstrosities seemed to him somehow even more real than the spiders, and yet hiding behind a veneer of dreamlike prescience. Something great and megalithic rose behind the trees, dwarfing them all. It was hideous and black like them, with tendrils like theirs, only far larger. It was covered in what Roger first thought to be open sores or wounds. However, the rows of teeth and twisting tongues within these confirmed to be mouths, all opening and closing, though whether they were gnashing their teeth in hunger or in pain, he couldn't tell. What he could discern was that the gargantuan entity, which was in no way tree-like, was the progenitor of the dark forest, the lord of these woods. The dark cloud of fog swirled around it, and a deep, forlorn part of him knew that it had crossed over from some other ceaseless dimension and into his own, bringing its brood along with it. As Roger clung to his sanity with a feeble, slipping grasp, he saw one particularly dark and leafless tree make its way towards him. That mournful wail coming from somewhere deep within inside of it. Its branches moved against the wind, stretching around and scraping great gashes into the ground. The tree had to be at least 15 feet around, and yet had moved to a point directly before him with a motion so inexorable that it almost seemed fated to meet him. The nightmare deepened as a crack opened along the trunk of the tree and grew, first vertically and then horizontally. It widened into a gash, a wound, a gaping hole that never stopped growing. Soon, Roger found himself staring into the tree as the border of the maw quivered in anticipation. The sound of starving wails coming from its depths. Unable to resist the impulse, Roger looked into the open jaws of the dark tree and saw a blackness deeper than any he had seen before. A darkness that quickly began to ravage his soul and wrest from it the humanity that was wound tighter than the webs in which he'd been stuck. Roger stared into the dark as the mouth of the tree stretched around as if to swallow him whole, and that darkness became his own. Now Roger found himself staring at the same darkness. He was standing in a doorway of the temple, staring out into the great black expanse. On the other side of the expanse, beyond the empty nothingness that awaited him, there was chaos. Something glowing in pale green roiled in a mass of primordial protoplasm. Around it danced the indescribable things which were contradicted by the piping of some psychotic tune on ancient wooden flutes. He didn't fully understand, but he had a feeling these quasi-musical accompaniments kept the roiling masses under control, kept it asleep so that it never thought to awaken and wink the universe out of existence. These thoughts and realities assaulted Roger as he tried to resist them. He wanted to back away and leave this mad temple, but before he could, something caught him from behind the knees and he had tumbled through the doorway, finding himself rolling on a tough but invisible ground. He scraped his knee where his jeans had been torn and felt something wet atop it, but he thought little of this as he turned from the chaos and back towards the doorway where he had fallen. He saw Jess there, balanced on one leg. She used the other to kick him through the door, but now, before he had a chance to stop her, she put her weight on the door and pushed it shut with a cold metallic thud. Roger heard the sound of latching, but the door rapidly began to fade away, until, despite his nearly unearthly and hideous protestations, vanished altogether. Roger turned back to the chaos in the distance, but saw that it too had disappeared into the void, taking with it the blasphemous things and their lewd piping shrill. There was nothing here, nothing there, nothing anywhere. The void was all that was there for him, the dark of Erebus stretching away for the entire universe. And despite the days, the years, the millennia he felt he searched for the Reaper, it could not be found. All that remained was the same darkness that he found inside of the tree. In the void, even death had abandoned him. Jess fell down beside the door, its bolt firmly latched to keep the madman imprisoned. She crumpled against the aging wooden frame, her hands pressed against it as her emotions overwhelmed her. She traced her hands along a strange word that was etched upon the door in letters she recognized. Korah. She had no idea what it meant, but believed it may have been connected with the invading shadows and the final home of Roger. As she lay there, her chest heaving and tears streaming down her face, the terrible name began to appear in her mind. The name of the dark. The name that she'd seen on the ship. The name predating the heathen gods and long-dead pantheons. It was coming. She knew, crossing boundless eons, sending monsters and madness as its emissaries. Slowly, the silhouette from the temple's entrance moved to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. The shadow matched that of her companions and began to tap as to get her attention. Jess lifted her head and turned to the one beside her. reaching for the comfort of the dark, just began to laugh. Lisa stood atop the mausoleum and stared at the cemetery around her. Though the stars had made themselves visible in the sky above, their light was again diminished by the creeping black fog that seemed to be oozing from the graveyard's furthest reaches. It drifted slowly, as if carried by wind she couldn't feel, beneath a moon she couldn't see, and in a silence so deafening she could almost hear it pulsing in her veins. The screams that had echoed across the tombstones had disappeared, swallowed by the silence, eaten by the shadows, and consumed by the creeping black mist. Ahead of her, she could see the iron fence standing 8 feet tall and surrounding the cemetery. The fog was pressing up against it, but it seemed the fence would allow no passage. And so, the formless was contained, along with the pitiable dead. That, at least, was a comfort to her. They had released the fog. Lisa understood that now. No, that wasn't right. Rather, they had released something. Some giant, interdimensional lever that had been holding 2 dimensions apart, and now those 2 universes were colliding. The fog was merely a symptom. That other dark and pitiable realm bleeding its darkness into their own reality. And across that indiscernible distance, something from that universe was crossing over, if it hadn't already done so. When Kevin had held her ear to the ground, she heard sounds of its approach, of its madness, of its unholy emptiness corrupting all that it touched. Behind her, Lisa heard a skittering sound as of nails scraping and tapping on the glass barrier between her and the interior of the crypt. There was a tap, tap, tapping, and then the whine of something sharp and jagged dragged across the foggy surface of the skylight. She thought for a moment of poor, thin Charlie, trapped in that horrid place, the pieces of him that were left laying as a satiation for the carnal bloodlust of that which lay in the crypts below. She thought for a moment, only for the briefest of moments, of unlatching the skylight and letting poor Charlie out, freeing him from his prison and becoming his salvation. But in a flash, the moment had passed and she knew she was unfit for the task. Besides, it could very well mean the end of her. She turned her gaze back towards the edge of the tomb and saw the mangled corpse which waited below. It stared at her with cold, unblinking eyes, dead, lightless, and with a grimace of pain that would never leave its lips. I didn't have a choice. Now did I? Lisa cried out in frustration, spinning away from the cadaver. You were going to kill me! You arrogant, self-righteous... She trailed off for a moment as she considered her words, and she tried to remember the events which had spelled the end of broken Kevin. He was going to sacrifice me. Don't you understand? She yelled, though in the end her voice began to rise. He was going to feed me to the dark. He called out to the shadows and tried to stab me. I remember. He tried to force himself on me, to pull me into the darkness with him, but I wouldn't go. I would never jump down there, or it would have killed me like it did to him. He's the one who jumped. I had nothing to do with it. As if in response to her jarring claims, there was the sound of shattering glass behind her, and the skittering sound grew louder. A scream cried out from below her, a deep, raucous cry that seemed to become less animal and more manlike the longer it proceeded. Lisa ran to the corner of the roof and hunkered down. She started rocking back and forth, hugging her knees to her chest. The air grew noticeably colder and warmer, as she was caught in the waves of an ocean tide which was pushing her away, then pulling her close and again, hot then cold, hot then cold. When at last she couldn't stand not knowing what was happening, she turned towards the skylight and saw only a great massive cloud rising up and blotting out the stars. It began drifting towards her, picking up speed as it enveloped the roof of the crypt. It stretched out its pale arms to embrace her, and as the skittering filled her ears, as the last shred of her hope fought to resist extinguishment, she was comforted by the fact that the horrible darkness was trapped in the graveyard, for it could not cross the fence. The elemental iron was holding it at bay. Here it was, and here it would be forever, along with all of what it brought forth. The girl's screams joined the chorus of others, but this was soon drowned out by a silence so empty and cold that one would have thought the cemetery was living up to its name like no cemetery had before it. The shadows and fog continued pressing against the fence,
but the fence held and would not budge an inch. However, near the entrance to the graveyard, the main gate lay ever so slightly ajar. There was the faintest creak as the door was tested. It moved an inch, then two, then it stopped. Slowly the fog began to pour through the open portal, drifting across the sidewalk that surrounded the cemetery and flowed into the street that dipped toward town. One by one, the streetlights began to go out.